Welcome to Writer's Morning Out. I'm happy to welcome Jody Savage today, who's going to give us a presentation on aesthetic editing. Jody is a former technical writer with multiple FDA submissions to her credit. Under her Stella Fosse pen name, she is the author of a book about writing, Aphrodite's Pen, The Power of Writing Exotica After Midlife, a story collection, The Erotic Pandemic Ball, which is fun, and her debut novel at age 68, Brilliant Charming Bastard, which is also fun. Her first book under her pen name, Jane Ishka, was a scientific memoir, The Year of the Mite. Jody lives in the Triangle with her partner and publisher, Graham Baird. So welcome, Jody.
Thank you. Thank you, Carol, and welcome everybody. It's great to see you here for Writer's Morning Out. So I'm going to start sharing slides about our talk today. And I always have trouble with this part. Play from the start. Here we go. Okay. So creative editing or ecstatic editing, or whatever you want to call it, I've developed this method, which may be a little different from what you're used to, because frankly, I hate editing. My philosophy about writing is that it's play. And to me, editing never felt like play. In fact, I found it pretty unpleasant. So I wanted to develop a way to bring play into editing as much as possible. And that's what we're going to be sharing about today. Our first drafts, our playful drafts, are always gorgeous, and our editing process brings them fully to life. So what I've asked everybody to do is to bring an excerpt from something that you're working on to practice the techniques that we're going to be talking about today. And the activities for this workshop work best with an excerpt of a page or two, but we will also be talking about editing activities that you can do later on your own with a long manuscript. So what's this about? So as I said, editing, like writing, can include play, and we can bring our imagination to our editing. What we're going to be doing is starting with big ideas and working down to fine detail. And we're going to ask that the inner critic part of our personality still step aside for our initial editing phases, but we're going to invite that inner critic to the final proofreading stage when we get down to that detail level. The very first step when you're editing is to do nothing at all. And I think of that as the cocoon phase. When we're writing a first draft, we're really engaging our imagination, our memory, and when we edit, it's better if we can separate from that imaginative first draft. And why is that? It's because we want to see what we've done, what we've written with new eyes. And in particular, we want to bring a sense of curiosity about our own work. And so it's great if you write and then let your work rest. And again, if you think of it as a cocoon only looks quiet. An awful lot is happening in there in between the writing of the first phase and the editing phase. So after the cocoon phase, there are three main stages of editing. And again, we're starting, if you think of it as an inverted pyramid, we're starting with big ideas, working down to a small point. The three main stages are developmental editing, where we're going to be expanding on the most engaging ideas in what we've written, and then reorganizing what we've written. Line editing is the second phase, where we're going to be editing the content, really focusing on the words, the phrases, the paragraphs. And then the very last phase, where again, we're going to be inviting that inner critic to help us out, is the proofreading phase. So what I'm going to ask everybody to do So we are going to be doing some activities with our drafts in this workshop. And this first activity is going to be exploring and adding on to what we've written. And so for the material that you brought with you today that you're going to be editing, the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is to after you mute yourself, is to read your work aloud to yourself and to bring your curiosity to that process. And lots of times when I suggest that people do this, I get questions about why read out loud. And there are a couple reasons for reading out loud. One is it gives us a whole different sensory input about our writing. That's very different. When we hear our writing, it's very different than when we see it on the page. And it lets us hear what flows well, which is going to be actually very useful when we get to that line editing phase. But also, even more than that, it lets us hear the parts that really engage us about what we've put together, the words that we've written, and lets us have more of an understanding of where we want to write more. So as you're reading out loud, what I'd like you to do is underline parts that you wonder about, parts that strike you as especially compelling. And then what I'd like you to do is expand on those ideas, take some notes about things that you would like to express that you haven't yet expressed in your first draft. And also, when you read out loud, think about things that you might add in terms of sensory details, in terms of details about the setting, in terms of details about what people look like, how they're moving in the scene. Just think about what might work in terms of adding material to what you've written. So I'd like you to do that. I'd like everybody to mute themselves, read out loud. We're going to take 10 minutes to do this because I really want you to take time with it. And then at the end of 10 minutes, you'll hear a chime and I'll ask you to come back. Before we do that, let me stop sharing, and I want to see if anybody has any questions about what we're about to do. Please speak up or raise a hand if you have any questions. All right. Okay, so I'm going to start sharing again and set the timer for 10 minutes.
And I'm going to pause the recording.
Very good.
I'm still here.
Okay, so I'm recording.
This meeting is being recorded.
I'm here too.
Okay, so thanks everybody for participating in that developmental editing activity. I have the next phase set up as a breakout activity, but we could also do this as a full group. We're sort of on the edge. How many participants do we have, Carol? Let's see if I stop
have
sharing.
8.
I can.
We have
We
8,
have 8.
including you and me. So 6.
Yeah. Okay. Does anybody have a preference for small group versus just talking about this as a larger group?
I'd like to stay with the larger group.
Okay, very good. So in that case, let's just give some feedback now. If somebody would like to read your work to the group, what I'd like folks to do in terms of giving feedback is to let the reader know what you find especially engaging and also what you would like to know more about, having listened to what they read. So those are the two types of feedback that are can be most helpful at this phase of developmental editing. That's assuming anybody would like to read, and of course it's always completely voluntary. Les, I see you have your hand up. Let's hear what you've done. Yeah, I think you have to unmute though.
All right, thanks, Jody. This is from a novel I'm writing, so it's the beginning, it's the second page, actually. Poland, 1934. Tolek Stanovsky hoisted his son, Stashi, onto his shoulders, then stepped down from the trolley. Tightly clutched in the child's hand was a coarsely woven sack that held their lunch. Perched on his father's shoulders, Stashi pretended that he was mounted on a horse, making clicking sounds to mimic the sound of its hooves. To his son's delight, Tolek added to the illusion by snorting and cantering. Laughing, they wove their way through the Sunday revelers and headed for the small park in the town center. It was the same routine each week, but they never tired of it. And the child's eyes glistened with the sights and sounds of the Sunday revelers. In the plaza, musicians played waltzes and polkas for women dressed in brightly colored silks and their elegantly dressed partners. They spun and twirled in a kaleidoscope of shifting patterns and colors, an old world painting brought to life, bubbling with excitement and energy. I'll just read one page, okay?
Yeah.
Astashi pulled on his father's collar, bringing him from a canter to a walk, and finally a stop, just as he's seen real riders do. Easy, boy, he murmured, while patting his father's head. Tolek, adding to the illusion, responded by neighing and shrugging his shoulders playfully. Papa, stop, I'll fall. Well, if you were ever to ride a real horse, you'd better learn to hold on. Astashi clamped his thighs tightly against his father's neck, bringing additional snorts and a complaint. Whoa, not so tight, you'll strangle your horse. They both started laughing as they paused in front of the bandstand to marvel at the spectacle of sights and sounds. Papa, did you and Mama ever dance like that? Astashi, your mother was a wonderful dancer. So alluring was she, with movements so light that people placed bets on whether her feet actually touched the ground. Really, Papa? Did they really say that? And you, did you dance like that? Okay.
Mm. Wow.
So this was the second, actually it was page 11, the first chapter was the introduction. This is a flashback.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All the contrast between the way they, the pretend horse and the dancers is really, the whole thing has such a great sense of movement. Yeah. I like the part where he pulled on the collar, on his dad's collar, and said, easy boy. That's great. What did you add? What's new?
What did I add during this? Well, this was a first draft, and what I thought I would do was expand the horse thing. First of all, in the imperfect, it was in the present at the time, and it sounded much better in the imperfect. So that was the first thing I noticed. Also, sometimes I added a little bit to the background material with the dancers. I changed some words, some adjectives, which I thought would be a little better fit. There wasn't much time to do this, so
Yeah, right.
this whole thing was a first draft. So
Mm-hmm.
I actually put myself in the mind of the little boy clinging to his father. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking forward to this weekly routine.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the story was pretty sad. You missed the first chapter. So I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I found it quite engaging, and I like the sensory details, like the coarsely woven. Was it the shirt that was coarsely woven? His dad's shirt.
Coarsely woven sack where he kept his lunch.
Sack. That's right. Yeah, that's a great detail. And the bets on whether the mom's feet ever touch the ground. I like that.
Thank you.
Anybody else
I
have
like-
any comments? Yes.
Yeah, I like the image of the old world painting. They look like an old world painting. I thought that was nice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well done. Anybody else?
Thank you.
Anybody else want to share before we move on?
Oh, yeah. Whoops. Sorry. Overall list, it was just light and bright and airy and so engaging. It was just fun.
Thank you.
Naturally, I love the boy turning his daddy into a horse and his daddy cooperating so beautifully, having done that as a child myself. And it's just, but I felt like there was a really good use of, you said you changed some adjectives. Well, they all really worked for me. It just felt bright and fun.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'm kind of left with some foreboding because I don't know the story yet, but there's like this foreshadowing about why isn't the mother there? And she's obviously absent or gone completely.
Mhm.
I'm feeling bad already.
Thank you, Les.
Thank you for your comments.
Okay. All right, I'm going to share screen again. So thanks, everybody. And now we're going to talk about the next phase of developmental editing, which is organizational. And this is one of those activities that is really a solo activity for you to do after this workshop, because we won't have time to deal with something the scope of a full manuscript. But one of the main things about this phase of developmental editing is thinking about what you want your reader to know when. I don't know about you, but I find that when I write a first draft, I tend to really dump character backstory into the draft. And only later, when I go back to edit, do I really think through this question of what I want the reader to know when about the characters. So I think of that technique as drizzling backstory, giving the reader just what they need to know at a particular point in the story. And of course, some backstory you may completely reserve and not share, but just have it in mind as you're writing. So another aspect or another way to look at this, especially if you're a pantser. Wait a minute, I said the wrong thing, didn't I? It's planner. I get these terms confused. If you're a planner as opposed to a pantser, actually, I suppose it could apply both ways. You want to be looking for the organic order of your story. If you're writing something that tends to be pretty structured, like a romance novel, for example, where there's a very set structure about what happens when in Act 1 and Act 2A and Act 2B and Act 3. When you're redoing your draft, when you're editing your draft, you can have more of a sense of freedom about where to place what when. So that 3-act structure is great if it suits your story, but again, feel free to modify that 3-act structure as you're editing. I find it useful to use file cards for scenes and decide on the ideal order based on looking at the big picture. I know there's software to do that too, but for me, the hands-on works well. So in summary, determine your best organization for that expanded draft, because hopefully you will have, by this point, you will have taken this technique of blowing out your draft, of expanding different scenes in different ways, and applied it to your full manuscript. So expand, then reorganize, and then we're going to move into the next phase. And to learn more about both of the parts that we've talked about developmental editing, both the expansion and the reorganization, the first handout that you folks have access to has more information about that. Any questions about that before we move on? All right, so now we're going to talk about line editing or content editing. And this I think of as creative subtraction. If you've expanded your draft in lots of different ways through the developmental process, and then you consider your draft as if it were a block of marble and you were a sculptor, and you're going to be subtracting what you don't really need from your draft and allowing the fully realized image to emerge from your sculpture, from your expanded draft. So for this one, what I'd like you to do is reread that expanded just generated and think about what's what's needed and what's extra. You may find that now that you've expanded your draft, that some of your original material isn't necessary, that it doesn't really add to where you really want to go with your story. And one thing to keep in mind is don't be afraid to delete passages that you like. You know, they talk about, what do they say? Killing your babies? Is that the phrase?
Killing Your Darlings.
Killing your darlings. That's
It's
it.
Stephen King.
No,
Stephen
it
King
dates
said
back,
that?
it dates back
Didn't
way
he?
before then.
Yeah.
But I mean, he actually put it in his book on writing, I think.
Yeah, but when was, I mean, I remember hearing that in the 70s in college. I think,
As
I
I
think it's
remember,
very-
it comes from a lecture, I think either in the late 1800s or the early 1900s from a professor at Oxford, I believe. I'll look that up again and I'll include it in
Yeah,
my
great.
notes. It's, yeah,
oh, good.
yeah.
Oh, good. That's great. Because I do think it's important. We get attached, at least I can't speak for anybody else. I get attached to certain phrases, to certain ideas. And then when I look at them in this full scope of what I've written, I realize that sometimes some of the things I like best are actually distractions from the real point of the passage. So let's just, what do you think? 5 minutes for this one? Because we are looking at short passages in our work, but let's take 5 minutes, reread what you've written and think about what might be extra and consider crossing out some of what you have written previously or today. All right, here we go. So Carol has put in the chat the information about the Kill Your Darlings, which is terrific. And so again, what we've been doing is a sort of accordion process where we expanded what we're writing and then we're contracting it again. So that contraction is the first phase of line editing. And the second phase of line editing is looking at language and deciding whether there are phrases in what you've written that don't exactly say what you meant, or that simply aren't felicitous in their sound. So what I'm suggesting that we do as a solo activity after this workshop is to read our work aloud again for sounds as well as meaning, and modify phrases to say exactly what we mean and to say it in a way that sounds good to our ear as we read it out loud. And also, lots of times adjectives and adverbs that we think are adding to the meaning or the power of our words can slow us down, can slow down the reader and detract from what we're writing. So consider taking some of those out and not having as many modifiers in what you write. So that's another idea for line content editing. So does anybody have any questions about any of that, or want to share something that they've written where they've done that accordion, expanding and contracting? Judith.
I had a much harder time with the contracting part.
Mhm.
So I just went, but I contracted a lot. I mean, I would have to completely, I'm working on a slightly over a one-page scene at the end of my novel that's already been critiqued, and I hadn't gone any farther with it. And I'm just going to have to go back to it and make all the changes when I was both first expanding and then contracting. And then with a clean draft, I'm going to look at words and phrases and
Okay.
felicitous expressions and
Okay.
try to nail it.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'm glad that was useful, a useful process.
Yeah, but it's interesting for me. The hard part was the second
contraction.
part was the second
Yeah.
5 minute was much more painful.
Okay, well, good. It sounds like it was useful, though. I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Jody, I would imagine that it would be, you really need to look at more than one page, the context of a bunch of pages before you would want to contract, I would imagine. Otherwise,
You
you
might
know,
take.
it's the context that you want to contract too. So
Yeah,
this was very difficult in a single page to do that without
yeah.
other stuff.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. This is a process that's designed to be used with a full manuscript or a chapter at a time. But of course, in the context of an hour-long workshop, you know, we can't really do that kind of work on a longer piece. You're absolutely right, Les. It does make sense to do this with a longer piece of writing. And of course, if you're writing a novel, you don't want to take out a detail that turns out to be important 2 chapters down the line. So you really do have to have your full manuscript in mind as you're doing this work. So that's a very good point. Any other comments about this before we continue? Okay, I'm going to share slides again. All right. Okay, so I don't think we're going to do this reading passages at this point, unless is there anybody particularly wants to read at this point? Otherwise, I think we're going to move on and talk about proofreading, which is the final stage of editing. And why is it the final stage? For me, I'm always tempted to do a ton of proofreading as I go. I think partly because at one point I proofread for a living. So it's very tempting to do that as you go. But keep in mind that our editing process that we've been talking about does have a logical order: expanding, contracting, line editing, and then when all that is done, proofread for grammar and syntax. The challenge is that if you proofread too soon, then you go back and add and subtract material, you could end up inadvertently adding grammar and syntax errors into the modified material. So, you know, then it's not the end of the world, but it does mean that you have to keep proofreading over and over again. So it can make some sense to wait. So when we finally get to the point where we have something close to a final draft, then it makes really good sense to go back and check for all these things: voice, grammar, verb tenses, spelling, punctuation. Repetitive word use is one that plagues me. I kind of get stuck. I get on these sort of slogs where I just use the same word over and over again. So use a style guide is a great way to back yourself up when you're proofreading. The handout has some recommendations for style guides. And of course, also you could hire a grammar editor, swap drafts with a writing buddy, enlist a helpful friend. Judith was so helpful when I was finishing my novel. I had been through it so many times proofreading it, and she caught things that I just didn't see at all. And you know, the main point, of course, is that proofreading takes multiple readings and multiple pairs of eyes to really get it right. And there is a handout, as I said, about this as well. So altogether, we have we've reviewed the basics of developmental editing, line editing, and proofreading, and we've edited a small portion of your work. And to go on from here, please take a look at the handouts that are on the website. Continue using these techniques to edit your full manuscript, and work with a partner, a writing group, or a paid editor to implement these different steps. And then, of course, there are publishing options that we've talked about in another workshop: traditional hybrid, and indie. But again, I do encourage you to look at the handouts because they go into a lot more detail about each of these stages than we had the time to do here in this workshop. So any questions about any of this? I'm going to stop sharing slides so I can see everybody. Any questions about these methods or the order in which we've done them or how you can use them with your writing that you're doing?
Jody, I'm wondering if you're bound by a word count, what advice do you have about that?
Oh, I've been in situations like that. I tend to go through, if I have a word count, and sometimes they're really strict. I've had, situations where I have to take something that's a couple hundred words and turn it into 100 words. And the first thing to do is kill all your adjectives and adverbs, of course. Just think about modifying phrases if they're really necessary. Think about if you're actually saying the same thing in a couple different ways and you don't really need to do that. Introductory clauses can go out the window. And then at a mega level, at a bigger level, just, when you've done all that stuff, think about if there are just simpler ways to say what you're saying. So you've gotten rid of all the words that are extra. I realize this is the opposite order from what I've just advocated. I'm talking about word editing and then big picture. But I think for something like this, where you already have something written, you shrink it down. That can make sense to take out, the low hanging fruit is things like adjectives and adverbs.
Thank you.
Sure. And a short version can often turn out to be stronger than what you started with.
Yeah.
What's the other saying? I wrote a long book because I didn't have time to write a short one. Is that Hemingway?
It's a good saying.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Any other questions?
No, this has been very helpful, Jody. Thank you.
No, this was really, really helpful, Jody.
Well, you're
appreciate
very
it.
welcome. You're very welcome. I thought we were going to run way over, but actually we have 2 whole extra minutes. If anybody else has questions or wants to read what you've written today.
Because you knocked out the adjectives and added contractions.
What?
It's because you knocked out the adjectives and added contractions.
That's right. That's exactly right. No, I didn't have us do every activity because I thought we were going to run out of time. We did every activity. We talked about every activity, but we didn't do a separate line edit activity for words and phrases. I think you all got the idea. Everybody here is a great writer, and I'm sure you can take this from here on your own. So thank you. I've really enjoyed sharing this material with you. And again, I do hope you'll take a look at the handouts because they have all this in more detail. And Carol, will the slides be up as well?
If you would like them to be, yes.
Sure. I think that would be great if that would be helpful to people.
Okay.
And Carol, where do we go to see these again?
It's in the chat. Can you find the chat? It's along the controls, either at the top or the bottom of your screen, where you stop or start the video or participants or.
I think Judith was referring to the entire lecture or lesson here.
Right. I'm going to
For
put
the handouts.
I'm going to put the recording and the slides in the same folder with the handouts. So that
Okay.
link will work for it all.
And that'll be at the Writers Morning Out website.
No, it's on the Google Drive. It's on our Google Drive.
I'm not acquainted with that.
I'm not either. That's what I was
That's where
asking.
that's where I have put documents. And I, it's usually linked either from the website when I summarize a program, and in my summary in the newsletter. So, of the past ones.
So we'll get that in our email then?
Yeah, you'll get that in the email, but it's also in the chat. Can you all see
Can
my
everybody
chat?
see the chat?
It's not, when I click on chat, I found chat, I've got chat is listing, you gave Jody's email, and then you gave this wonderful selection on the origins of Murder Your Darlings.
Scroll up.
And I don't seem,
It's up above my email, Judith. It's the very
Yeah.
first thing that came up on chat.
Yeah, scroll up.
Nothing there.
I don't see anything either.
Here, you
Okay.
know what? I'm gonna share it again. I'm gonna, here.
Okay.
Okay, I've just shared it again. It should now be the
thank you.
very last chat item.
Save chat in English right in front of my very eyes. I'm so excited. However, I don't know where it's saved, so.
Oh, no, it will give you, it'll give you an option to where to save it. Oh, and when I pull up when I click on the command chat, and now I'm seeing it, the 3 little dots, and it does say, I can save the chat.
Ah, okay.
To my computer, so.
Oh,
let's
it
see.
does say.
Aha,
chat.
there it goes. The light bulb has gone off.
2 light bulbs.
All right. I hope I don't blow my circuit here.
And then when you click on it, it should ask you where you want to save it.
Yes. Oh, my God.
It's just
All right.
easy peasy.
See, we have lessons in editing and lessons in Zooming, all in one little hour.
Again, thank you very, very much, Jody. Really appreciate it. Some great
Definitely.
information here.
Okay,
Really
okay.
appreciate it.
You bet. I've enjoyed it.
Thanks, Jody.